Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/wehaveways. Hello and welcome to a We Have Ways Festival Dry podcast special. This was recorded at the weekend of the 8th to the 10th of September at Black Pit Brewery at We Have Ways Festival Dry in the HQ tent.
Morning everyone. Still standing. Thank you. Well, welcome to We Have Ways. Anyone new today? A few hands up, yeah. Well, willkommen. Anyway, this I've been looking forward to, and we've already had a little bit of a chat about it. Two great pals of the show, two great pals of mine, Jonathan Fennell and, of course, John McManus. And we're going to be getting stuck into Italy because, of course, it's the 80th anniversary, people. And it's the 80th anniversary of Avalanche this very day. Of course, that's exactly why we timed the festival for this weekend. Jonathan and John. And also, I was quite prepared to be talking to about 17 people. So the fact that so many of you here at 9 o'clock, congratulations and hugely appreciated. I just want to say that. So the Italian campaign. I mean, we were talking about this the other day a little bit. It's such an obvious next step from Sicily. You know, you've had these huge victories. You've had defeat of the U-boats in May. You've had the start of the all-out strategic air campaign. You've had Tunisia, which is a massive, massive victory. And suddenly the Allies are sort of getting their shit together, aren't they? They're kind of working out that this is a three-dimensional war, air, land, and sea, and they're kind of working out how they're going to how they're coordinating that, and they're starting to look like the real thing. Then there's Husky, the invasion of Sicily in July and into August, and that all goes pretty darn well, whichever way you look at it. To take an island of that size and that sort of topographical challenges and all the rest of the logistical challenges in 38 days is pretty good going. And you can see under the kind of the heat of the Mediterranean with the sort of lemon groves around you and olive groves, etc., and vineyards. You can see why you'd think, let's push on, and and you can see why it seems like a fantastic idea. And you've also got, the next big fixed thing is Overlord, which at this point is planned for May 1944, not June 1944. But there's quite a gap between August, it's 10 months basically. 9 months. Math's never my strong broadly. So there's 9 months, and you've got these huge forces in the Mediterranean now. So you might as well do something. And yet it kind of spirals out of control pretty quickly, because the truth of the matter is, for all the huge arsenal that the Allies have, the incredible shipbuilding capacity, landing craft building capacity, that huge sort of global reach, they've got a huge amount on their plate because they're supplying the Soviet Union, they're supplying China in a big way. There's the whole campaign in the Pacific, there's the whole campaign in Southeast Asia, there's preparations for Overlord, there's the strategic air campaign, and everything has to come by sea. So Italy is kind of, it looks great on paper, but there's a lot of, it's sort of bottom of the list a little bit. And that's what very quickly kind of comes in and comes into play with the campaign. It all goes, it's all pretty good to start off with, survive Salerno, get Naples, get the Foggia airfields, tick, tick, tick. Then it starts to rain, and the whole thing just descends, doesn't it? Very, very quickly into kind of awful.
It makes sense as the next step, and it makes sense for the airfields, I think, from that standpoint. It makes sense from the idea of destroying and eliminating the weakest of the Axis partners in Italy. But in some respects, in retrospect, it might have made more sense as a limited objective kind of campaign. It's almost as if Rome was a proverbial bridge too far, in a sense, because when the winter intercedes, it's just horrendous. And so then it becomes the classic mission creep. What are we really here to do? Is it get Rome? Is it get a backdoor into Germany or into Yugoslavia? Is it to meet the Soviets as far east as we can? It really kind of sideways of all that.
You're talking about mission creep. I mean, one of the biggest bits of mission creep is Foggia. So Foggia is this area of this flat land. I'm sorry, you're stealing my own sandwiches for midday, to be fair. But it's a really obvious place where you can have heavy bombers, B-24s, B-17s, and what have you. And it's closer to the southern right. And in the autumn of 1943, of course, there is this panic going on in Britain, which is, yikes, we need to get total air superiority of the whole of Northwest Europe before Overlord, and we're not close to that at this point, and what are we going to do? And so the more strategic air forces you can chuck at the problem, and if you can have them not just operating out of Britain, but also operating out of Italy as well, that's great, because the aircraft factories, which they're trying to target with Operation Point Blank, which becomes the kind of, the number one strategy for air power from the beginning of June 1943. The point of those aircraft factories are in Austria and southern Germany, and are easier to get from Foggia than they are from East Anglia, or from England. So you can see why. So suddenly, instead of having 6 bomb groups planned for southern Italy, it goes to 21, and you're already got a logistical challenge.
Well, you do, and the other thing, there's a reverberation of consequence, because once you get beyond that, and once you're thinking about Rome, the idea of Rome begets Anzio. Well, that then leads to consequences for Overlord because of pushing it back about a month because of shipping. But really, and I think this tends to get overlooked, it has consequences for China, Burma, India, because there were resources promised to Chiang Kai-shek for, I think it was Operation Buccaneer, landings in southern Burma, that then the Western allies have to kind of renege on that promise.
Yep.
That has terrible consequences for what will happen in China. So yes, the Italian campaign, I guess that second phase is successful in the sense that eventually we get Rome, but I think it really has some significant reverberations beyond that, though.
And the other consequences for the troops.
Exactly.
Yeah. So there's a logic to it. There's a logic to the decisions that are made strategically.
Yeah.
But then the poor guys who've been there for, let's say, 3 years, they're starting to get tired, they haven't been home, they haven't seen their loved ones. That's the great consequence. And then that's, I think, what we want to talk about, isn't it? So how in the world do you get these individuals to go again? How do you remobilize these individuals?
I think it's just that the promise of August, when all this is kind of ticked off, on the 17th of August, when the green light for the plans for Italy are given the go-ahead, the sun is shining and it all looks fine. By the middle of October, it's an absolute horror story already, because you've got all these the whole of Italy is just one big freaking mountain, basically. And where there's mountains, there's rivers, and the rivers are going to the sea, and so they're cutting across, they're running at 90 degrees to the direction you want to go. The Germans, it's very easy for them to blow up every bridge as they're retreating on not particularly good roads anyway. These roads are designed for mules and carts, and the occasional Fiat Tipolino, and that's basically it. What they're not used for, expecting, is sort of thousands upon thousands of Bedford trucks and tanks.
I mean, it's heartbreaking in a way, isn't it? I mean, so the British and Commonwealth forces have just discovered a way to defeat the Germans using this firepower-heavy approach, making use of these trucks and these tanks and all this technology. And it ain't so useful in the terrain of Italy, where there's hardly any decent roads. And where there are roads, you can predict where the Allies are going to come from, so the Germans can prepare for them. So they have to find this other way to get the job done. Yeah,
and it's just the conditions, the privations which everyone is having to suffer are just so grim, because when you're fighting, you're going up a mountain, or you're having to cross a river, or wade through mud, and you're camping out in tents or bivvies or under a rock or something, and it's just completely miserable. The supplies are just not good enough, and supplies goes down to absolutely everything, because when it comes to Normandy, infantry battalions, whether you're in the US 4th Infantry Division or whether you're in, I don't know, the 15th Scottish Division, the replacements are coming through thick and fast. So what would happen is you'd do a big battle that would last sort of maximum of kind of 4 to 6 days. Then you'd be pulled out of the line. Then you'd be obviously down by a third. Then another third would come back in and replace that. So then you'd have 2 weeks off, and then you'd go put in the line and do Operation Blue Coat or something. But you're back up to full strength again by then. None of that in Italy. I mean they are constantly. I'm talking about Allied battalions here. They're constantly under strength.
There is some amazing stuff on this for the Americans in particular, isn't there? So Samuel Stufer and a whole pile of social scientists go in and do this incredible amount of research on the American army during the war. And I think one of the things they find is in that Italy, the troops don't actually necessarily know each other, especially the replacements. They come into these units, and it's not necessarily this band of brothers narrative where everybody knows each other over many years. The casualties are so high that you're often fighting with people who are total strangers. And that is a different ball game. That is emotionally very, very challenging when you don't have those close ties immediately.
Yes, because people always, anecdotally, when you're talking to people, veterans, but also in diaries and stuff. I mean, people say, well, why are you fighting? Well, I'm fighting for my mates. That is the number one reason. They're not fighting to defeat Hitler. I mean, obviously people are, but the vast majority of people just want to keep their head down and get through it and survive and go home.
Yeah,
and what is stopping them from running away?
Stouffer had found exactly that. He said, what enabled you to keep going on when things were rough? And the number one response given was not wanting to let the other guys down. And he also found, in Italy, that about 2/3 of those who were fighting had come in as replacements. The 34th Infantry Division was one of them. Remember that survey? And I think it really kind of, at least for me, revised my view of what I had originally thought the replacement experience would be, which was total ostracization kind of thing. No, you really couldn't afford that because almost everybody was a replacement. So, today's replacement by, this time Wednesday is the veteran. Yeah. And that's the nature of the fighting, especially for Red Bull, the 34th Division, which is consigned to this theater permanently. So they're just in the middle of this mess. The other thing, too, I would point out is that, the Allies in going up the peninsula have handed the Germans, in this sense, a prime opportunity. This is an army that knows mining and booby trapping and then has ideal terrain for all of this defensive warfare. I can't imagine a better place for defensive warfare in the sense of you don't have to expend much manpower coast to coast, plus you have mountains that are doing a lot of defense for you, like Jim said, the mountains, the rivers, the choke point valleys and all this kind of stuff. If you wanted a place to bleed the Allies, I don't know what could have been better.
So it's cold, it's wet, frostbite is back, 4 British soldiers die from exposure. So, how do they keep them going? Yeah.
I mentioned to you the other day. There's this photograph which I don't have to hand, but it's of the I think it's the Grenadier Guards who are coming down off Camino, Monte Camino, which is a 3,000-foot peak. It's one of the two kind of sort of guardians of the Mignano Gap. So this is about 8 miles, 5 to 8 miles south of Cassino. So what's that? 75 miles from Rome. And there's these two huge mountains. There's Sammucro on the right-hand side as you're advancing up Italy, and Monte Camino on the left. And I've walked up Camino and Sammucro, and these are really, really brutal places in which to just operate in winter. I mean, just to walk up there in winter would be hardcore. To fight up there is frankly insane, because there's just very little soil. And there's lots and lots of sort of scraggy limestone all over the place. There's very little cover. And of course, if you're being mortared or shelled, where you really want to be is in mud, or sand like Dunkirk, because it just absorbs it. On a mountain, it's just, the shrapnel's just going absolutely everywhere, but not just the shrapnel of the exploding shell. Also the chips of rock, which are razor sharp and can whip off an arm or kill you instantly or maim you for life or whatever. I mean, it's an absolute horror story. And this photograph I was mentioning, you see them coming, you see them having been 10 days. So they're not fighting 4 days or 6 days like they are normally. It's like 10-day battle. basically the first half of November. And you see them coming down, and I really had to do a double take when I looked at what those are guardsmen. I mean, they look knackered. They've aged 10 years. They look hangdog. They just look an absolute wreck. And they're down to about, from a battalion of kind of 900 men, they're down to about 340.
That kind of complex terrain, does it require a skilled or an unskilled army? I mean, it requires an incredibly skilled army. And if you think about I think the way the British and Commonwealth forces had developed their fighting technique, it became firepower heavy, so lots of artillery, advance behind the artillery. When you're shot at, hit the ground, call in more artillery. That isn't going to work in such complex terrain. And there's no time to retrain. I mean, they go from, as you say, from North Africa to Sicily to Italy. There's not much of a break. And so it comes down to, can they suck it up? And it comes down to a battle of wills, because there isn't time for the other stuff.
Yeah. And this is my big kind of pat on the back for the Allies. They do win, against the German army that we're constantly told is superior in terms of weaponry, in terms of discipline and all this kind of stuff and training. And yet they do win, and I just find it endlessly fascinating. I remember, I'm jumping forward a little bit here, but I remember going to Monte Altuzzo, which is actually on the Gothic line. So we're talking about September 1944. And I remember being at the base of that, and it's this kind of sort of horseshoe ridge. And I think it was it's either the 85th or the 88th Infantry Division, US 88th Infantry Division that attacked it.
88th,
It's the 88th. Yeah. And you just look at it, you just think, why on earth would someone from the Midwest of America be fighting up here? What are you doing? And people always talk about the sort of staying power of the Germans and the fact that, isn't it amazing that their morale is so good that they can keep going. Morale is absolutely terrible for everybody. It's terrible for the Germans, it's terrible for the Americans, and yet they still do it. And I think it's just so fascinating. What is keeping them there?
Yeah. I mean, like you said, why is somebody from the Midwest, someone like me, fighting in those rocks? And that's what this is, especially that first winter, like late fall 43, especially from a third ID point of view. When you're fighting around Mount Majullo and all these places, you're fighting amid the rocks, you're climbing. You're basically mountain climbing even to get up there as an infantryman, and you're fighting with rocks at times. It is that dramatic. But we're also fighting these small unit actions where, it's the Germans over by those speakers there behind those rocks, and thus us over here. And when I'm wounded, there's no way Jonathan can get me out. I mean, how am I going to get down the mountain? So where is there a triage system in that? What's that going to do for our morale? How's that going to do for replacing my bullets, that I've expended in that firefight or whatever else? It's really an incredibly grim environment in that sense.
So let's talk about morale. And I think try and talk about a crisis and what constitutes a morale crisis. And is a morale crisis a fundamental failure? I mean, if we get Clausewitzian on this, right, we go kind of theoretical, what is the heart of this thing called war? It is ultimately probably a battle of wills. It's a psychological challenge. And so I think we have to normalize the fact that morale goes up and down. We can't see poor morale as somehow a massive criticism of the troops. It's just normal. Human beings have limits. Human beings, all of us have our limits. All of us have the potential to crack.
Who wants to be fighting
exactly.
up a mountain in the rain?
The Germans have morale crisis. I mean, look at Moscow at the end of 1941. That, my friends, is a morale crisis.
Yep.
Okay? That makes this look very, very, not much of a problem at all.
Right.
So all sides are suffering ups and downs. So what is morale? I mean...
Yeah, I would say it's less of a problem for the Germans because if you run away, you're going to get shot. You have absolutely no choice in the matter whatsoever. I mean, you can escape.
Yeah.
But we, the Allies are not shooting people for desertion. So how do you maintain that effort when you're in a miserable place, you're being rained on? When you're not being rained on, you're wading through mud or you're being shelled to pieces on top of a mountain. And you don't know half your colleagues.
Yeah.
And you're a long way from home, and the mail is intermittent, and I know mail is a really key thing. How do you keep people going? How do you stop them from going? Do you know what? Sod this for a laugh. I'm going home. Forget it. Put me in the glass house. I don't care.
I mean, I think it's supplies and relief. In other words, if you can get enough supplies, if we can have some level of fresh food, maybe we get a hot meal every now and again. If we can get the mail in, if we can make sure that I understand in the next attack, I'm going to have plenty of artillery support. And that if I have some relief, because if there's one thing that most any combat unit resents or believes, particularly in the infantry, it's that, everybody else sucks, right? You're angry at the world and you're like, well, we always get the worst details, this is the worst. And if you're stuck in the mountains for 2 weeks, you become convinced no one else cares and no one else is doing the load that you are. But if you are rotated out along what seems like some sort of fair schedule, then that's better for morale. But can you really do that, in the realities of this moment? How are you going, when you're dealing with these, troop shortages and whatever else? I think that's one of the reasons why morale is
But Jonathan, you've
difficult.
done a lot of work on German morale and as well as Allied morale. I mean, what I've discovered is there is lots and lots of concerns from Allied commanders about, yikes, we know this is tough on the guys. We know we're pushing them harder than we'd want to. We need to up the ante with the post. That needs to come more regularly. We need to kind of make sure the rest camps are good, all this kind of stuff. There's lots and lots of chat about that. I didn't see a huge amount from the Germans going, I'm really worried about our men and their morale.
So I'm learning about German morale at the moment, and it is utterly fascinating. So I've been reading the German censorship reports. So those who are kind of familiar with my work, I've looked at the British and Commonwealth Army censorship reports. So soldiers write home. Those letters are censored for obvious, security reasons, and they're turned into morale reports, usually kind of 20 pages long. The Germans do the same thing. In fact, all the major combatants do the same thing. The Americans do the same thing. They're trying to understand this thing. For the Germans, morale is almost more important in a way, because they know from the very start the whole logic of the war, the logic that they can win this war is because they are psychologically more robust than the weak, effeminate, that's the language they use, democracies.
Yep.
Okay? And so the way that they can make up for their material shortcomings is by having superior morale. The Japanese make, I think broadly a similar calculation, right? So the necessity to inculcate morale amongst German forces is absolutely vital to their success. And we can talk a little bit about kind of, how they manage to do that. I mean, for sure, they have access to one tool that the Allies really don't have, which is, real, meaningful coercion. I think the figures are, 20,000 German soldiers are shot by their own side during the Second World War?
Yeah, if
20,000.
not more like 30, I think.
I mean, that's the fighting portion of, 4 or 5 divisions? I mean, it's a whole division of troops. And we know the Soviet Union shoots, 13,000 at Stalingrad? And we think over the course of the whole war, they shoot no fewer than 200,000 of their own troops.
The U.S. Army shoots a grand total of 1.
The British don't shoot anyone.
Eddie
Don't shoot
Slovak.
anyone.
Yeah. British what?
British don't shoot anyone.
None. Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah.
Now, listen, right, we know, on a few occasions, the War Office is a little bit concerned about the lack of stick. And in fact, there are very serious debates within the War Office and Cabinet about, should we bring back the death penalty to, encourager les autres, to try and offer some sort of a kick if it's needed. And ultimately, the decision is made. There is probably a need. It was a mistake to have got rid of the death penalty, but we could never actually publicly admit that we need to do this, so we can't do it. So having a stick is helpful within reason.
So the stuff you've been doing on the Germans, I mean, what are they saying?
It's familiar, which is a little bit uncomfortable, right? We like to think of the German as something other, but they are human beings like you and me. In some ways, I think to de-idealize ideological war. For most people, the private local was more important than the national public. Most of them were not hardcore Nazis. The ideologically pure were a tiny minority.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting to try and work out, where are they putting the ideological people? Where are they putting them in the officer units? Are they putting them in the army? Are they putting them in the navy?
That certainly chimes with my research and stuff, and all the diaries and stuff that I've been looking at and accounts that I've been looking at. They're all, particularly the diaries. Obviously, the diaries are written on the day, so there's none of this kind of sort of, I never liked Hitler anyway, kind of retrospective crap. I mean, they're absolutely in the moment, and several of them are really tortured. There's this one guy called Jörg Zellner, who is a battalion commander in the 44th Hochen-Deutschmeister division, which is an Austrian division, but he's actually from Augsburg, which is in Germany. And his crisis. It's just so painful reading these diaries because he's so obviously a decent bloke. I mean, he's impossible not to like. And he worries about his mother, he worries about his wife and his kids back home in Augsburg. He looks at the Italian towns in ruins and he just thinks, is this what's going to happen to Germany? And then he thinks of his wife and his kids and he thinks, I've just got to keep going. I've got to do this because otherwise this is what's going to happen to us. And what else can you do? But and then the next day he's cursing the stupid war and he's going, where the hell are the Luftwaffe? And and then it goes to black humor. So he's like, I've decided to take my boots off tonight after all because at the end of the day a shell doesn't care whether I've got my boots on or not. And it's impossible not to be moved by this.
So there are, get this number in your head, there are 40 billion letters sent between the German home front and the battlefront during the Second World War. 40 billion. That is an astonishing highway, right, between the home and the battlefront.
Yeah, isn't it?
And 99% of the material contained in these letters is, how's Johnny? How's he doing at school? Is the food okay back home? I heard that there was a bombing raid. Is everybody we know okay? And so it becomes very normal. And the ability then of the German state to support this interchange, to ensure that the German soldier feels connected to his home, it becomes, I think, a central part of the war for all the belligerents. But when you can see the 40 billion letters, you get a sense of the power of this relationship at home.
But also, there's the German army and there's German troops and there's people in German uniforms, and they're not the same thing. And the 65th Infantry Division, for example, is totally annihilated at the Sangro and at Ortona. I mean, just gone. I mean, it just ceases to function. And when German commanders are going, this is ceasing to function, you really know that it's ceasing to function.
You know it's serious then.
Yeah, it's true. And they have German officers, but most of the troops are Czechs and Poles. They don't want to fight. So a lot of those casualties are prisoners.
And this is a real amazing change that happens in 43, right, in 44.
Yeah.
So by 44, I think there's about 1 million Hiwis, the kind term, basically foreigners, if you will, fighting within the German armed forces. If you think what the Allies are doing, the Allies are replacing formations with Poles, with Free French. So they're finding manpower elsewhere. And it's only really as we get into this period of the war that we start to see some of the basic functionings of the German army, and all the armies start to come apart at the seams. So the German army is organized in a territorial manner, right? So a Westphalian division is replaced, come back to replacements, by Westphalian troops, and the same goes for other parts of Bavaria.
Yes, because they have these ersatz battalions back in Westphalia, where they're just training more people up, and then they get sent to the front and they go and join the real division rather than the ersatz one.
And so that holds together until, I think, we get a bit further than where we are, probably about the middle of 1944. And so what we see is no single argument that explains this Allied victory that starts to happen in 43, 44, but the German system starts to come apart at the seams. The thing that's holding the institution together, the replacement system, falls to pieces. The ability to connect to home starts to...
But on top of that, you're then having to change the way the officers are trained up, because you can't, in the old days, what you do, the officer corps in the 1930s and in the first part of the war, you'd have to go in as a private, then as a Fahnenjunker, and you'd have to kind of prove your leadership skills and your mettle. Then if you get past that, then you go to Kriegsschule, and the whole process of becoming an officer is quite a drawn-out thing, and it ensures that the people who do end up being frontline officers are really top notch. That's all gone by middle of 1943. You haven't got time, So people are just being given commissions in the field, and people are just being sent off, and NCOs promoted, and so on. It's a completely different system. But what they are starting to do is make sure the officers are Nazis rather than not across the board, but just more so. And so what you're getting is the people that are in leadership positions are in those positions because they're good, honest Nazis, rather than because they're brilliant leaders of men. And then those who are working with the old-time veterans who are just really, really good soldiers but couldn't really give two hoots about National Socialism are then rubbing up against the Nazis And they're irritated because they know they've got this absolutely useless commander, but he's a good Nazi, and he's getting all the kind of, all the preferential treatment and not looking after the men. And, it all starts to just completely implode.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder too if in the German army, if there is just this kind of unspoken endemic belief in the war aims of the party and the government. And the reason I say that, on the U.S. side, very, very few U.S. combat soldiers are really going to be talking about how they believe in the liberation of Europe, and,
right.
and they're in it, for the four freedoms, and they love the Roosevelt administration and everything it wants, and all this kind of stuff. But I'll tell you what, most believe that sort of organically. It's just embarrassing to talk about, and I think that's one of the reasons why in the Stouffer morale studies, and they're studying everything, but. Why the Allied cause is sort of lower down on the list, because I think that would have been not cool, to say, yeah, I believe in that, rah rah, Norman Rockwell, I'm for that. You just didn't talk about that too much, and I wonder if maybe there's something on the
but
German
it's there,
side
isn't it? It's there underneath. It's kind of a latent thing that's keeping people together. So if you take the German situation, or we could equally do the American or the British Commonwealth, everything is straining under the utter pressure of 3-4 years of war. I mean, everybody's exhausted. Systems are starting to break down to an extent. And so there's this requirement to fill the void with ideas to an extent. So you can see the ideologically pure start to become more prevalent in the...
And also in February, you've had the Sports Palace speech by Goebbels, which is, okay, we are now in total war, and this means that everyone's involved, and this is, are you all up for it, and all the rest of it. And it's this change of tone. This is not no longer a war for conquest and Lebensraum. This is now a war for survival. The tone has completely changed, and that's obviously that filters down to the front, doesn't it?
And it does. And so
or does it? I mean,
I think it does. So this is where I think it does, right? And especially, let's talk about the British soldiers for a second. So the late 1942, we have something called the Beveridge Report, right? Which is it's fascinating, absolutely amazing document. It's the kind of the blueprint for the creation of a British welfare state, And initially, it is kind of shelved by the government because they're concerned that how in the world are they going to bring about this kind of radical social change in the middle of a global war? It ain't possible in Churchill's view. And, fair enough, okay. But it gets out amongst the troops, and the troops learn about it, and they say...
Well, they issue it. They then decide that actually, no, they're not going to clamp down. It's really important that the troops, after 3 years of war, 3 and a bit years of war, that they have... this is what they are fighting for. This future Britain. This is the point, and it is the Britain of welfare state, and a national health service, and more housing and jobs and all the rest of it. And to be frank, that is delivered in the 50s and 60s. Never had it so good and all the rest of it. But they decided it is important, and it's really interesting because I have come across a number of letters and diaries where people are talking about it, and a copy of the Beveridge Report, which I think is published in January 1943, gets sent to every single British serviceman. So they make that decision. So there's a huge queue outside His Majesty's stationery office in Whitehall on the day that it is released by the general public, and the general public have to go and buy it. It's one of those sort of buff-coloured...
It's like 600,000 copies sold. I mean, this is a government report. I mean, it's insane. And there are queues.
Don't they all sell that way?
And they then decide to send this to every single British serviceman. And they all get it. And it's... And they do that because they feel that they need, at this stage, everyone's a bit tired, everyone's a bit fed up, it's sort of dragging on, that everyone needs a fillip, and they need to kind of know what they're fighting for.
Isn't
that amazing?
It is amazing in a sense that this interaction takes place, and that ideas...
Well, you think about Britain in 1939 to 1943, socially, structurally.
War accelerates the pace of change dramatically.
So these ideas about social justice, I mean, things that we often don't associate with a war like this.
Right.
What is the quid pro quo? What is the negotiation between the state and its citizens? And especially in a democracy, that's a really powerful negotiation. And the Americans, it seems, get it right to a very meaningful degree. I mean, Roosevelt does promise the world to the troops. You get the GI Bill. You get effectively the creation of a welfare state for American soldiers post-war. And there's a debate. Okay, so there is a fractious debate about whether or not beverage will be rolled out. And the troops get a sense of this, and they say, that is what I want. Yeah. You give me this, and we'll get the job done. And the uncertainty over whether it will be rolled out causes frictions and does cause some of the morale problems that I think we're talking about today, right? So how did the frustration over beverage does undermine morale to an extent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what about the Germans then?
Okay, so my sense of it so far is that the German state manages quite effectively to navigate fairness through those middle years of the war. That if you are a bombed-out German citizen, your family will be looked after. And that the kind of narrative that comes out of the censorship summaries is that the war has been managed in a fair way for, if you will, the racial polity that is Germany in the mid-1940s. And that again sits a little uncomfortably in that they do get some of that stuff very right in terms of the interaction between the citizen and the state. One aspect of it I find fascinating is the use of women. There's a debate, Germans are running out of troops, frankly, by 1943, right? So in part they're bringing in foreign troops to try and make up the losses, but they don't make use of women in the factories. The logic would seem to be to comb out more men from the factories and put in more women. The number of women in German factories during the war stays broadly the same all through, which is astonishing. If you look at the state of the British economy or the American economy, the number of women absolutely takes off. And the reason that they won't do this, the reason that they won't bring in more women into the factories, which seems like an obvious thing to do, and many within the Nazi hierarchy argue that they should, is the morale of the troops. They think that German soldiers will lose the willingness to fight if their loved ones are made to work. Which is interesting.
Well, they want to make sure that the German public are not going to have some of the same privations that they had in World War I that had led to the German state buckling then, especially in relation to hunger and consumer items. I mean, so the Germans are basically plundering all of Europe in order to feed their own standard of living in that sense.
So it's the fear of 1918, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it absolutely is. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're also clearing out every Jewish property in Western Europe and shipping it back to people who've been bombed out. I mean, it's the logistics spent on that. I mean, the amount of trains. I mean, you're talking about sort of 85,000 trains delivering furniture from plundered Jewish properties in Western Europe to Germany. I mean, just think about that. I mean, it's just staggering.
So I'm personally benefiting from the war.
Yeah.
And then that creates this connection with the war. Right. And it becomes a war that you take a personal stake in.
Right.
Am I getting something out of this? The personal trumps the public. I think especially, it's worth saying again, the personal trumps the public. People are making calculations based on the welfares of their families and their communities and the people they know. It's really, I think it's dangerous to think that these are complex modern societies. They were not all ideologically of the same mind. And people were making these kind of calculations about their own interests.
And yet, also then, in that sense too, the average person is made complicit in the criminality of the Nazi regime in that sense too.
And that is the case, yes, without question, I think. Yeah.
Crazy.
It is.
But all those German, I mean, so many of the German troops are worrying about, the bombing, strategic air campaign. I mean, Alan and I have been talking about this a lot in recent weeks, and you just forget the morality for a moment, just park that. But it has to be seen as pretty successful on a number of different levels, not just economically, but psychologically as well. And okay, yes, the German people are able to take it, and Germany doesn't completely collapse or everything. But you're a frontline soldier in Germany, and your family's in Regensburg or Hamburg or Dusseldorf or Essen or wherever,
Berlin,
or Dortmund or wherever, or Bremen. One of your you're concerned about just surviving in Italy, but you're also worrying all the time about your family back home, about whether they're going to be bombed, and whether you're going to have a home to go back to, and whether you're going to have a family to go back to. And just imagine what that's like, fighting in the front line in somewhere as awful as Germany. And okay, the Germans are on the defense, and they've got the easy job in terms of the fighting bit in Italy. But let's face it, it's not a picnic. I mean, defending in Italy when you haven't got the same artillery amount of you haven't got the same amount of artillery as the Allies have, and you're being shelled the whole time, and you can't see any Luftwaffe, but you can see plenty of fighter bombers, Yarbos, and others kind of hovering over you all the time. It's absolutely brutal, and also the casualty rates are just absolutely appalling. I mean, they're appalling just like they are for the Allies, and that has to get you down, even if you are a good Nazi, even if you are actually wedded to National Socialism, and even more so if you're not.
I was surprised by how much material there was in the bombing war in the letters of Eastern Front soldiers. And in many ways, the thing that was shouting at me out of these censorship reports was the thing I care about is my wife, my sister, my mom is getting bombed back home. And that they're talking about killing, loads of Soviet soldiers. They cannot believe the number of Soviet soldiers they're killing. And there's a sense that actually we're doing okay. That's, we look back now and we think, well, 43, 44, the game is over. But actually they think they're very much still in the game. And the concern is mum and dad, wife, girlfriend, daughters, whatever, back home.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, how about the Italians? Let's throw that into the mix
well,
too.
I was just about to bring that up. I mean, it is for those that are sort of caught up in this typhoon of steel. You just have to think. We've all seen these sort of footages of twisters going through somewhere through the sort of southwest of the US or something.
Or
I kind of sort of that always just makes me think of Italy. So suddenly, you can be in one village and you're absolutely fine. But if the war front just happens to go through where you're living, it's like the twister. It's just going, and it's just everything is just being destroyed, because the truth of the matter is the Allies have got this firepower heavy approach, and so what they're doing is they want to liberate Italy, but what they want to do more than anything else is liberate Italy with the least loss of life possible in a very dangerous and fraught environment. And so if that means just blowing up an Italian village to save half a battalion of men, they'll do it, and so they do, and so the levels of destruction are absolutely appalling. But also because the Germans have a very, very deliberate policy as they retreat of doing a scorched earth thing. So they kill all the animals or take them themselves, and they blow up everything, and they poison the water, and they set booby traps all over the place, and blow up any kind of industrial infrastructure they can, all to kind of make it harder for the Allies to advance.
Yeah, I mean,
and there's Germans who, there's German diaries sort of going, well, it is a bit tough on the Italians, and I do feel a bit sorry for them. But on the other hand, they did stab us in the back. So.
Exactly. So it's all justified then. Yeah, the hell with them. No, I mean, the irony of the whole thing is the Allies clearly represent something better than either the fascist regime or these German occupiers. They represent something better for Italy in the long term. So I guess you could think of them as liberators, but they also come with that level of destruction. And in that sense, you get a preview of what's about to happen in Western Europe, what will eventually happen in the Philippines too, that you, for lack of a better way to put it, you have to destroy this place in order to save it, weirdly.
Yeah, and that's the
problem.
That throws up all sorts of sort of moral conundrums, because, how much bad do you have to do good? How much evil do you have to do good?
And what is the ultimate good? And
right.
And also too, and there's this subplot in the whole thing, which also is true elsewhere, all over the planet during this war, but especially in Europe, is there's an Italian civil war going on. Which side are you on? There are still Italian fascists in play, especially in northern Italy, under Mussolini's rump regime and in league with the Germans. You have the anti-fascist partisan, many of whom are communist. How well can we trust them? What about the average Italian citizen caught in the middle of all this? This is rendering families apart, in all strata of society. In addition to the incredible poverty that's now in play, especially in southern Italy.
Well, there's a lot. Absolutely, and there's a lot of poverty anyway. But the scale of it is awful, and part of this is also because of the Allied military government, which is imposed of occupied territories, AMGOT as it's known, later just becomes AMG. But a lot of the stuff is worked out by kind of sort of desk wallers back in Algiers, who have a kind of limited understanding of what Italy's like. There's no question there's a strand of vindictiveness. You declared war on us in June 1940, you had it coming, don't expect too much sympathy from us. That kind of attitude. And Italian inflation is appalling. All the men have gone because they've all been rounded up by the Germans or they've been captured already. So there's hardly any young men around. Women haven't got enough, so they're trying to keep their families going. I mean, some of the tales of these Italians trying to kind of just exist are absolutely heartbreaking.
I don't think we pay enough attention to the Italian experience in the Second World War. Totally. I mean, let's just go back to say 39 and look at the latent strength of the Italian economy. Right, the Italian economy is not that much smaller than France, and France is considered a great power. And we look at post 45, there's the Italian economic miracle where it just takes off, right? So there is a latent potential within Italy for war fighting, for war mobilization. And the fact that they don't convert that potential into effective fighting, I think, is a big story. Why does that happen? Well, I mean, I think we could go on for a whole new session on that. Right?
But it's partly because of their geographical location. They don't have access to the world's oceans, all that kind of stuff. They back the wrong horse, etc.
Do they ever?
Didn't they ever? And they've got Mussolini, and then he wastes money, and he's a terrible, terrible leader.
And we come back just to doing the basics of military operations. I mean, how often does Mussolini mobilize his forces and then send them back to the farms, mobilize the forces, send them back to the farms? It means, how do you create cohesion amongst the units? The stuff we've been talking about. How do you stop a morale crisis? Well, you make sure you know each other. You make sure you have these cohesive units.
There's none of that in
There's none of that. You look at, I've been reading the Italian censorship reports, and they are amazing.
There they are.
Goodness me.
Well, I've got to say, I mean, you read, we all have these sort of racial stereotypes and social stereotypes. I mean, when you're reading letters from Italians, I mean, they really don't disappoint. I mean,
it's right.
I mean, I remember reading some for Alamein, and it's the Germans are going, this war is awful. My tank's blown up. The RAF are over. Curse the Schweinhund or something like that. That's about as bad as it gets. The Italians like, oh my God, the reign of the awfulness has come down on me. I want my mother, and this is the most disgusting food ever. And the RAF come over. How long will I have to suffer this torment? I'm in hell. I've been, etc., etc., etc. And then when you actually do get to Italy and you start reading the diaries, there's not much change. It's like, oh my God, we're doomed. This is awful. I wish I was dead now, but I still quite want to live. And oh God, it's absolutely incredible, and it's kind of hard to take it seriously. I mean, the first one you go, God, this is really dramatic. Wow, what a you highlight that thing, think, oh, I'll definitely use that one in the book, and then it's like, and the next one, and the next one, and the next day. And,
there's like 100 of these. So okay.
And it's there in the censorship reports too. I mean, it is.
Yeah, of course.
It is, and the Italian censors are saying, what the hell are we going to do? Because all the Italian soldier cares about is his mother and his family. And it comes back to your previous point, but then inflation. So what does the Italian soldier read? He reads, well, Mom can't buy, whatever, because it's now cost 15 times what it cost, 3 seconds ago. And so again, that relationship between home and front starts to play out. So they can't get the basics of the military organization right. They can't get the interplay between...
Sending only left-footed boots to Greece and stuff in 1940. I mean... So when the Allies got into Sicily, they found all these depots full of boots, but they're all kind of size 13. And Italians have kind of tended to be on the small size. I mean, I'm sort of exaggerating, but I mean, the reason they hadn't, there were lots and lots of captured Sicilian soldiers wearing sandals or nothing or threadbare boots. Wasn't that there weren't boots? There were lots and lots of boots in Sicily, but they were just completely the wrong sizes.
There's a lot to be said for competence, isn't there?
Why would you do that?
There's a lot to be said for competence. I mean, I know, and we talked, previously, I think, here and in other places about, say, logistics, and just the basics of moving things from one place to the next, getting things in the right order, getting what you need at the right place at the right time. And the Allies are broadly pretty competent at doing the basics of the maths of war.
Yeah.
And it makes a big difference. It makes a difference, again, coming back to the topic, to morale. And your previous point, if you have food, if you have the proper equipment, if you receive a letter that morning from your loved ones, you feel like, okay, well, I prefer to be somewhere else, but I'll get the job done today. And then tomorrow, if the same thing happens, maybe I'll crack on tomorrow as well.
You can hang on for a while.
Yeah. It gives you just, all you need is that little bit of extra.
Yeah.
And that comes often from competence.
You know what? This has actually been like a really typical We Have Ways of Making You Talk podcast, where we've gone down lots of rabbit holes. We haven't really stuck to the theme. And we certainly haven't.
A total lack of focus. It's exactly like our podcast.
And we sure as hell haven't drawn any conclusions. But on that kind of loose-ended note, I wonder whether we should see if anyone's got any questions. Yes. Just wait for the
John, the mic.
Wait for the mic if you don't mind. Thank you.
Hi. Is there anything that the Allies could have done and should have done to improve morale? Anything that was sort of realistic and viable given the circumstances? Anything that they kind of missed and perhaps learned to apply in Northwest Europe later on?
Well, my own view on this is that actually they do, the ground forces in Italy do pretty darn well, all things considered. I blame the chiefs of staff, and I think General Marshall back in May 1943 says if you're going to go for an operation, you've got to back it 100%, and they just don't. They just don't, because of the mission creep, because of the build-up of strategic air forces, because they're just too stretched, because of the crippling lack of shipping. They've got so much shipping, but they haven't got enough to do Italy in the way that they need to do it. The obvious way to fight in Italy is to outflank, because then you're not worrying about mountains. You're coming in on the coast, you come in the sandy bits, and you just constantly getting in behind the Germans all the time. So the Gustav line and the Bernard line don't exist if you can get enough people behind them. And the Germans are constantly worried about it and constantly overestimating how much shipping the Allies have. The Allies just don't have enough to do it. So I don't know quite what else they could do with the comparatively meagre resources that Alexander Clark and Monty in 1943 are given. What else can you do? I mean, they're constantly saying we need to kind of up the game with the mail and make sure that the post comes in more regularly and all this kind of stuff.
I might have made some gentle promises that maybe I didn't intend to keep. So I think, a watered-down version of Beveridge kind of happens anyway post-45. Could Churchill have just said, listen, we're taking it very seriously and we'll probably roll it out? I think it would have made an enormous difference to the troops to have been promised a vision for a post-war world that kind of made sense to them.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And 2020, hindsight is 2020. I think Churchill hoped that post-war world, he had a very different vision for what it should look like. It materialized anyway. So I wonder whether some gentle promises. Now, I guess the mistake was too many promises were made pre-1918. But yeah, I might have.
But my point is, I think the shortcomings of the Italian campaign come from right at the top of the tree, rather than at the ground floor. I think Allied military government is too big, is too unwieldy. It's a behemoth. There's too many troops. There's too many base wallers. That's a bad look as well. And people coming on leave to Naples, for example, they just see all these people swanning around in jeeps and stuff, and they're thinking, what the heck are you doing? Little staff officer.
Well, and that's what I was going to say. I mean, probably wouldn't have been possible, but I think the biggest thing they could have done for morale is implement for the ground forces what the air forces had, at least on the U.S. side, and that's a rotation system. Saying, okay, you serve here 3 months in combat, or you have a point system, and you're out.
But they don't have the capacity for that.
There's no way
they can't maintain the infantry battalions as this. What are you going to say?
Now I'm desperate to talk about the furlough mutiny and all the New Zealand stuff. I don't know. I've probably heard me talk about it before. I mean, so in like 10 seconds, the New Zealanders do send troops home for a bit of furlough. They get home, they're not so happy. They're mutiny and refuse to come back, and then that gets out amongst the troops who are still in Italy. So the fact then that there were blokes back home not coming back had I think played a role in, say, morale issues in the New Zealand forces. So that could be a double-edged sword, couldn't it?
But my point is, of all of this is the system higher up the chain than the army commanders. I don't think you can. I'm not just saying this because I'm an Alexander fan. I don't really think that Alexander does anything wrong at all. I can't see how he could have managed it better. I mean, he does what he does. With the chips he's been given, and ditto Mark Clark and even Montgomery, and there are criticisms that one can shove at all of those three, but I don't think morale crisis of rapidly increasing morale crisis, which they are all keenly aware of, as the campaign unfolds and as it becomes clear that Rome by Christmas is getting more and more distance and then kind of never going to happen in a million years. They're all massively concerned about it. But what can you do? That's your lot. I mean, it's just, for Allied troops, it is just definitely, particularly infantry and it is the short straw in Europe. There's no question about it. Hang on. Are there any ladies in the audience who've got a question? Yes. Yep, there and then here.
I have a question for Jonathan. Have you, in your work, uncovered any data about the Canadian morale, especially after Ortona?
Yeah, so actually we have some slides if we want to put them up.
Knew we'd get to that.
We didn't even plan this. That's amazing.
Way to go.
If you chaps have some slides, so one of the tools we can use, I think, the next one I think is better. No, next one. Next one.
It's always the next one.
Go. Is there? I thought there was one more. Anyway, so the sickness rates in the in the Canadian forces go very high around that period, and I think one way that we can, as kind of historians, engage with morale as a really meaningful thing, rather than just finger in the air, is to use sickness rates. So medical professionals at the time, and I think medical professionals even today, would say that fluctuating sickness rates is your best way of understanding the morale in a formation. And certainly sickness rates, I thought I had this up here, in the 1st Canadian Division are they're at the bottom of that graph. So that the y-axis there, right, the one on the side, is inverted, right? So high sickness rates are at the bottom and low sickness rates are at the top. And the idea there is that high sickness rates indicate low morale and low sickness rates indicate high morale. And you can see the bit we're talking about, right? 1943, their Baytown and Avalanche, the advance to the Gustav line. That's the bit where morale is, the sickness rates are highest, really, for the British and Commonwealth forces during the war. And they're through the roof for some of the Canadian formations. They're really struggling. And there's some fantastic research on that. If you want to come up, I'll point you to it.
Well, and in Ortona, I think Vokes commits 13 out of his 14 battalions in the first 2 weeks. And he's got nothing left, and they still haven't even got into Ortona at this point. That's just getting to Ortona, and it's an absolute meat grinder, as I'm sure you're aware. And everyone knows that this is an utterly pointless battle. Okay. So and finally on the 27th of December you get Ortona. Great. I mean, what's the point? You're still nowhere near. You're still 15 miles from Pescara, which was supposed to be got in 3 days back in November, and and it's now the end of December. So it's an absolute horror story, and how anyone can keep going in that circumstances. These guys are not being. The diaries are constantly going. In fact, I just really, really hope we get a rest now. I really hope we get a rest. I hope we're finally taken out of the line, any minute now. And they're just not. They're then told, okay, you've got a day off. Right, next day you're forming up and you're going to attack again. And everyone's just had it. Absolutely had it. Lady down here.
Mobilisation of women in the war. So our part of the world, factories, food production, go to Russia, active service, Germany, not so much of either, to generalise a little bit. Did those different approaches have any noticeable different effects on morale?
I think it's maybe one of the great untold stories. I think women are at the absolute heart of this story. The extent to which they are used in the factories and how effectively they're used in the factories. And B, the extent to which they are communicating with their loved ones at the front line and how they're shaping their experience. So I think there's more to be said. And I think, yes, I think we can build a narrative around women's experience rather than just saying, here's how women were affected by the war as a kind of a passive thing, I think we can talk about how women are shaping this war and how women's experience is actually central to the whole thing. For goodness sake, do we have to, if we put the man part of that relationship, as a central piece for a second, which maybe we shouldn't, but that man's is definitely been shaped by his loved ones. I can't get over the fact that the Germans are so reluctant to use women in a really constructive way in the workforce when it is like the secret weapon that the Americans use. my goodness, it just explodes, right?
Yeah. In the U.S., there's an enormous percentage of women, especially 18 to 45 years of age, whose lifestyle completely changes as a result of some level of economic independence. The debate that's going to follow after the war is whether they should return to domesticity or whether this is a permanent thing. And this truly isn't resolved in any meaningful way until the social movements of the 1960s and 70s. So even in that sense, you can see this reverberation from World War II. Economically, I think it creates a great deal of efficiency in the American war economy that maybe otherwise wouldn't have been there.
And when we look at what women are serving, it tends to be elder women who are making up the new part of the workforce. It tends to be women often with a husband in the forces. So we have these families who are making double sacrifices. And again, I mean, that comes out in the censorship reports, right? My family is carrying everything. And if you look at what's happening with South Africans, so this big morale crisis in 1943, it's really powerful in South Africa. The South Africans send home their division from North Africa, right? And they say, well, we've got to send forces back. And because of the way the South African system worked, that required the soldiers to sign a new oath to serve outside of Africa. They basically had to volunteer to go again. They needed 60% of South African forces to volunteer so that they could put 2 armored divisions in the field. Only 23% said that they'd go again. And so there's basically a crisis in South Africa. We're out of the war. If we can't get the guys to fight, what are we going to do? And so they do all this social science stuff. They ask them questions, why aren't you going to serve? And they say, my family has done enough. And someone else can go do it now. So again, I think there's ways, I'm thinking about it, how to build that narrative around women. Yeah.
Well, I think we've run out of time, unfortunately, but thank you all very much for listening. Thank you, John, and to Jonathan.
Thanks for listening. There's tons more of this to come. We hope you've enjoyed it. And we hope you enjoyed the festival if you went. And if you didn't, this is what you'll get if you go next time.